There are men the world thinks it knows completely. Men whose faces have been burned into the cultural imagination so deeply that we forget they are human at all. We see the jawline, the shaved head, the cold eyes that could stop a freight train, and we assume, that a man like that has never once trembled, never once sat alone in a room and wondered if any of it was worth it, never once pressed his hands flat against his knees to stop them from shaking. But what if everything you thought you knew about this man was only the surface? What if beneath the most bankable action star on the planet, a man who has grossed billions at the global box office, there was a story so raw, so quietly devastating, that the people closest to him spent years trying to make sure it never reached you? What happened to him before the cameras found him? What did he almost lose that no amount of fame could ever give back? And why, at 58 years old, does he still carry something in his eyes that no director has ever been able to fully explain away? Hold on, because this is not the story you think you know. He was born in Shirebrook, a small coal mining town in Derbyshire, England, on July 26, 1967. Not London, not some glamorous city with gleaming lights and wide avenues of ambition. Shirebrook, a place built on labor and grit and the particular kind of stubborn pride that working-class English towns carry like a birthmark. The kind of town where men wake before the sun and come home after dark, where the soil itself seems to have a memory of toil baked into it. His father, Barry Statham, was a street trader and a lounge singer, a man of contradictions, a man who could charm a room and then vanish into the next one. His mother, Eileen, held the family together with the quiet, unbreakable strength that only certain kinds of women possess. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. The kind you only notice when it's gone. Jason grew up in Great Yarmouth after the family relocated, and if Shirebrook was raw, Great Yarmouth was something else entirely. A seaside town with a funfair energy on the surface and a deep, working-class exhaustion underneath. He watched his father hustle, watched him work every angle, watched him perform in dingy clubs for people who needed the music more than they could ever say. There was something in that, something Jason absorbed without even knowing it, the idea that performance was survival, that what you showed the world was armor, that you learned to make people feel something before they got close enough to see what was real. He was not a studious boy. School held little magic for him. What held magic was movement. Physical, primal, honest movement. He discovered diving, competitive diving, and there was something about the sport that seemed almost designed for a boy like him. The discipline of it, the solitude of the board before the jump, that suspended moment where the body hangs in perfect stillness between decision and consequence. He dove for the British national diving squad for 12 years. 12 years. That is not a hobby. That is a vocation. That is the kind of commitment that reshapes your body, yes, but also your mind. The way you think about fear, about preparation, about the difference between readiness and recklessness. But he never made an Olympic team. He came close. Close enough to taste it, close enough to measure the exact distance between himself and the dream. And that distance, that specific, particular gap, became the first great wound of his life. Think about what it means to dedicate 12 years of your youth to a single pursuit. To wake every morning with one image in your mind. To subordinate everything, friendships, comfort, spontaneity, the simple luxury of not caring about your body for one afternoon, to a vision of yourself standing somewhere great. And then to be told, in the cold arithmetic of competition, that great was not quite enough. Not today. Not this time. Maybe not ever. He didn't talk about it much. That was already the pattern forming. The thing that would define him publicly and privately for decades to come. Jason Statham processed pain the way his father's generation processed everything, by burying it under work, by turning the wound into fuel, by getting up and finding the next thing before the silence of the old thing could catch up with him. The next thing was street trading. He sold fake jewelry and perfume on the streets of London, working the hustle he had watched his father perfect. And there is something almost poetic about that image. This young man, built like something carved from English granite, standing on a pavement, learning the ancient art of making people want what they hadn't known they needed. He was good at it, not because he was dishonest, but because he was present. He understood people. He watched them the way he had once watched the water below the diving board, calculating, patient, reading the physics of the moment. It was on those streets, in the mid-1990s, that a photographer noticed him. And that one glance, that single moment of being seen by the right person at the right time, led to modeling work for French Connection, which led to something else, which led to a chance meeting that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. Guy Ritchie was making a film, a small, violent, brilliantly kinetic film called Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. He needed faces that felt real, faces that hadn't been polished by drama school, faces that carried actual life behind the eyes. He saw Jason Statham and made a decision in approximately the same amount of time it takes to throw a punch. But here is what the Golden Globe version of that story always leaves out. Before Lock, Stock saved him, Jason Statham had been circling a drain he refused to acknowledge. The years between diving and modeling and the streets of London had included long stretches of uncertainty so profound they bordered on despair. He had watched friends find their footing while he was still standing on the pavement in the rain with a case full of fake Chanel No. 5. He had watched the sporting career close like a door. He had felt, in the specific way that men who have been trained never to feel it, the particular horror of not knowing what you were for. There is a story, not widely told, not something he broadcasts, about a period in his late 20s when the future felt genuinely blank. Not blank in the way that means open and possible, blank in the way that means erased. He was 30 years old and had nothing that most people his age would have pointed to as evidence of a life built. No career, no savings, no trajectory. Just the body he had spent 12 years making into something extraordinary and a city that didn't particularly care. He stood on those London streets and he sold his jewelry, and he did not let anyone see that he was standing at the edge of something. That was the code. That was what men like him, from places like his, from the specific emotional geography of working-class England, were required to do. You carried it alone. You made it invisible. You smiled when you needed to, and you worked when you could, and you did not, under any circumstances, put it into words. This is the thing that nobody tells you about the men who become icons of toughness. The toughness is real, but it costs something enormous. It costs you the ability to ask for help when help is exactly what you need. It costs you the language of vulnerability at precisely the moments when vulnerability is the only honest thing available. And then, Guy Ritchie. And then the film. And then 1998. Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels opened, and it was immediately clear that something had happened. Not just to British cinema, which the film electrified with its fast cuts and wit and violence and working-class swagger, but to Jason Statham specifically. Critics noticed him. Audiences noticed him. There was something about his presence on screen that operated differently from acting in the conventional sense. He wasn't performing. He was existing, and existing, in front of a camera, with that kind of physical authority and those eyes that seemed to know something they weren't sharing. That turned out to be more compelling than almost anything else cinema had seen in years. Ritchie cast him again in Snatch in 2000. And now the world began to understand that this wasn't luck. This was someone. This was the real thing. And Hollywood, which has an animal instinct for the real thing, began to circle. The phone calls started coming from America. He made the one in 2001. He made the Transporter in 2002. And the Transporter was the moment everything shifted into a different gear entirely. The film was lean and furious and built around him like a glove, and audiences responded with a ferocity that surprised even the people who had bet on him. He was the Transporter. He was Frank Martin. He was a man of rules and precision and violence deployed with the elegance of someone who had studied the geometry of the human body for his entire life. And underneath all of it, beneath the suits and the car chases and the perfectly choreographed brutality, there was something warm, something human, something that the camera caught in the spaces between the action sequences, a loneliness that he never played for sympathy, but that lived in every frame regardless. The Transporter spawned sequels. The money came. The recognition came. He became, across the 2000s, one of the most reliably bankable stars on Earth. Crank in 2006, Death Race in 2008, The Expendables in 2010, where he stood beside Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger and did not look like a lesser thing. He looked like he belonged. More than belonged, like he had always been meant to stand exactly there. And yet, here is the thing about walls built from silence. They protect you right up until the moment they begin to collapse inward. In 2010, while filming in the South Pacific, Jason Statham found himself aboard a truck that lost its brakes and rolled into the ocean during a break from shooting The Expendables. He managed to swim to safety. He was fine physically, but the people closest to him at the time would later note something in the days that followed, a quality of stillness that was different from his usual composed silence. As if something had been shaken loose. As if the water had reached somewhere the training couldn't quite protect. He never spoke about it as a crisis. Of course he didn't. But water, for Jason Statham, had always carried a particular weight. The diving pool of his youth. The platform above it. That suspended moment. Now the ocean in the South Pacific, dark and salt-heavy and indifferent to fame or box office returns or the number of zeros in a contract. The water had a way of reaching him that nothing else seemed able to do. And what it reached, when it did, was something unresolved. Something that had been packed carefully away in the space behind his sternum since a teenage boy in Great Yarmouth first climbed a diving platform and looked down and decided to jump anyway. The professional machinery continued. It always does for men like him. Spy in 2015 was a revelation. A comedy that revealed his timing was as sharp as his physicality, that beneath the stone face was a genuine wit and a willingness to be made ridiculous in service of a laugh. The critics who had spent years categorizing him were forced to quietly recategorize. The Fate of the Furious in 2017, Hobbs and Shaw in 2019, The Meg in 2018, which returned him to deep water in a different kind of way. But something was changing, had been changing, was still changing. In 2010, he had met Rosie Huntington-Whiteley, model, television personality, one of the most recognized faces of her generation. They became, almost immediately, a quiet kind of private in a world that demanded everything be public. They did not perform their relationship. They did not feed it to the machinery. They held it close, and they held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters more than your reputation for toughness. They got engaged in 2016. They had a son, Jack Oscar Statham, on June 24, 2017. And here is where something happened to Jason Statham that none of his films had ever really prepared him for. Here is where the armor that had served him so faithfully for 50 years suddenly became something different in his hands. He held his son, and the silence he had always used as a fortress began to feel like a wall between him and the thing he loved most. You cannot build the same walls around a baby. You cannot out-discipline an infant's need for your complete presence. You cannot out-tough the specific vulnerability of being a father. He talked about it, slowly, in pieces, in interviews that spanned the years since Jack was born. How fatherhood had rearranged something in him. How it had reached places that the water had only grazed. How looking at his son, this small, perfect, entirely undefended person, had made him aware, for the first time in a way he could not sidestep, of everything he had spent his life not saying. He was not a religious man in any formal sense. He did not broadcast faith the way some people use it as a brand. But there was something he had, a kind of quiet belief in the body as sacred, in physical discipline as a form of prayer, in the idea that how you treat your body is how you treat the only home you will ever truly inhabit. He trained every day, still does. At 58, the discipline is the faith. The gym at 6 in the morning is the chapel. The silence of those hours before the rest of the world wakes up, that is the prayer. Not for anyone else. For himself. For the quiet maintenance of the man he chose to be. And perhaps this is the thing that the world most profoundly misunderstands about Jason Statham. We see the discipline, and we read it as coldness. We see the physical mastery, and we read it as vanity. We see the controlled public persona, and we read it as emptiness. But what if the discipline is tenderness? What if the daily commitment to the body is a man's way of saying, I refuse to abandon myself. I have been close enough to the edge to know what abandonment feels like, and I will not go back there. Not for anyone. Not even for the parts of me that are still tired. He is 58 years old now. The boy from Shirebrook. The diver who never made the Olympics. The street trader in the London rain. The man in the water in the South Pacific who swam back to the surface and said nothing about what it cost him. The father who holds his son and feels the walls inside him shifting. He is still making films. Statham and the character of Hobbs are set to appear in new Fast and Furious material. He continues to be one of the most physically committed performers working anywhere in the world. He does his own stunts. Still, at 58. Because the body is how he speaks the truth that words have always given him trouble with. There is a photograph, not famous, not widely circulated, of Jason Statham at a diving competition in his youth. He is standing on the platform. The pool is below him, lit in that particular pale blue that competition pools always seem to carry. His arms are at his sides. His chin is level. He is looking at the water, and you cannot see his face fully, but you can see the set of his shoulders. And what you see there is not arrogance. It is not invincibility. It is a boy standing at the edge of the only thing he knows how to do, deciding, again, to jump. He has been standing at the edge his entire life. And he has jumped every single time. Now I want to speak directly to you. Because you clicked on this video for a reason. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the headline. Maybe something in you recognized, without quite having the words for it, that this story was about more than one man in one particular life. Maybe you have your own platform, your own edge, your own pool shining far below, blue and cold and demanding. You know what it costs to stand there. You know what it costs to keep going when the thing you built your identity around closes its door in your face. You know what it means to carry something so long it starts to feel like part of your skeleton. You know what it feels like to look at the people you love most and feel the wall between you and them as something physical, something real, something that you built so carefully and so well that you're not sure anymore how to take it apart. Jason Statham never made the Olympics. He spent his 20s selling perfume on London pavements in the rain. He almost drowned in the South Pacific and told no one what it really did to him. And he held his son for the first time at 50 years old and felt something crack open in him that 12 years of diving and decades of fighting and all the money in Hollywood had never quite managed to reach. He went back to the water, not to escape, to find something. That platform is still there. The pool is still below you. The same pale blue. The same cold silence before the jump. The same suspended moment where you are neither who you were nor who you might become. Just a person at the edge, deciding. So here is the question this video is going to leave you with tonight. When the screen goes dark and the algorithm moves on to the next thing, and you're alone with whatever you're actually carrying. What are you still refusing to say? And who are you keeping it from? The world or yourself? Don't answer that here. Don't put it in the comments. Sit with it, the way he sat with it, for years, until sitting with it alone was no longer enough. Then jump.